I'd like to welcome you back to another episode of Explain Yourself. This time we're with John Vanek, who's another graduate student at NIU. You're in a doctoral program though this time.
Yes.
Last time we heard from a master's student, but we're moving up in the world. So if you could give me the elevator pitch for your current research.
Okay. So I'm studying how we monitor wildlife populations. The short and sweet one.
That's a really short sentence, but I know that there's a lot that goes into that very short sentence.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You want to expand on that?
Sure. So I'm working on a project that has been monitoring wildlife for the past 7 years. This is year 8.
Wow.
It's an ongoing project. I think it's supposed to go on for another couple of many years. And so basically it involves keeping track of populations of birds, turtles, reptiles, amphibians, small mammals, and medium and large mammals in northeastern Illinois, systematically at permanent monitoring locations.
Wow. Okay. So you've got like a whole bunch of different organism groups,
Yes.
which requires a whole bunch of different monitoring styles.
Yes.
And then lots of data crunching.
Yes.
That is a huge project.
Yes.
Okay. But it's exciting, and
Yeah.
it's very important that, that's what you do. So you told me what you're doing, but is there some sort of hypothesis or some sort of like question you're trying to answer or something you're trying to find with this wildlife monitoring?
Sure. So the area I'm working at is intensively managed. So they do a lot of prescribed fire, they do a lot of invasive species removal, they do a lot of native species planting, they do just a whole lot of actual management. And so what they want to know is, does all that management activity work towards their goal of increasing and maintaining biodiversity?
Okay, nice. So basically you want to make sure that there aren't any dips in populations that you're caring about.
Yeah, and so what's challenging for managing agencies is that the management activity that you do may have positive effects on one group of species, or negative effects on another, or both. And so it's really complicated, and so it's a really nice example of kind of triage, and you need to decide what's important. And so there are a list of priority species for the region who presumably have priority, although there's no legal priority on them. And so those are species that are thought to be either rare or representative of the region, that presumably the public enjoys because these are all public lands. So there aren't necessarily specific hypotheses at the broad level, but there are questions. How are these species doing? And then there are more specific questions as to how efficacious are the different monitoring techniques.
So this is a good illustration in this project that conservation is about making things work, but it's not, as many people might think, about like returning it to the pristine like ecosystem that it was beforehand. Like this is never going to be a perfect process.
Exactly.
Okay.
There's actually argument or friendly discussion as to what picture we want to go back to. So one of my professors in undergrad used to describe it as the big net of, or however you pronounce that word. There's a G next to an N, and I'm not really sure how that goes. And so in that wildlife management class that I took, my capstone classes in undergrad, the snapshot that we were trying to bring the world back to was pre-colonization.
So like pre-European.
Pre-European
but
colonization.
With Native Americans.
Right, which is a little problematic.
Yeah.
Because of the assumptions it makes about Native Americans just being part of the ecosystem.
And also
right.
that like our ideas of the populations of Native Americans are only from the perspectives of the European settlers, so the populations that had already been decimated by disease might not have been reported accurately.
Yeah, there's a whole, and that's just one, so one of the reasons I think that people choose that snapshot of time as what we are hoping to achieve through conservation is just because there are very little other options. The other options are to go back to the Pleistocene, before people crossed over the Bering Strait, and well, half of those, or more than half, though, those megafauna are gone.
Yeah.
So that's not a very realistic goal to go back to. So there's a lot of art in conservation, and there's a lot of judgment calls, which is what kind of makes conservation an interesting science.
I love that. I love the idea of thinking about what we do not just as like science and work, but as something with nuance and art to it. That's
absolutely.
Great. I love that. Beyond that sort of like big thought of loving the investigation of it, what is your single favorite thing about your current research project?
I like that I get to work with a diverse group of organisms. So I like to consider myself a general naturalist, so I like to know a little bit about everything. And then there are a couple things that I think I know a lot about. But I really like being able to work with mammals and birds and reptiles and amphibians and everything like that. And I think I'm just very fortunate in that sense to be able to work with such a diverse group.
Okay. Yeah, and I know you sort of like think of yourself as a herp guy, right? So like reptiles and amphibians, herps. So if that wasn't the group that you were specializing in, what different organismal group? Like if somebody told you could never play with snakes and frogs again, which I know would break your heart.
Mustelids.
Ooh, that's a good one. Okay, so mustelids are like the musky animals like skunks and weasels and otters.
Yep, badgers. And what's kind of cool is they've somewhat recently removed skunks from the Mustelid group, and they put them in their own family, Mephididae.
Really?
And if you look at the genetics and phylogenetics, they think that even though they superficially resemble mustelids, they're actually more closely related to procyonids, which are the raccoons and kinkajous and red pandas and things like. Now people put the red pandas in their own family.
Right, yeah. Oh my gosh, taxonomy.
So it's kind of cool. So
interesting.
Skunks can musk, obviously.
Right,
That's what we know them for. But so can weasels, and every ferret you've ever played with at a pet store or at your friend's house. They stink. And that's with their scent glands removed. So every domestic ferret is sold with their scent glands removed. And had those not be removed, they could spray like a skunk.
Really?
Not to the same extent or with the same odor, but yeah, so all mustelids, or most mustelids, can spray.
That is really cool.
And so it's just, and all mammals have, or most carnivores rather, have canids even in particular, have scent glands, right? It's why your dog licks his butt, or he drags his butt on the floor.
Or you need to take them to like
biting at his butt
to get those expressed.
Yeah. Or when your dog gets like scared and then it just smells terrible. So
I feel like you have experience with this, maybe.
Yeah. So it's more likely that the ability to spray probably evolved more than once.
Oh, okay.
And that skunks are just particularly good at it because it's a very effective way to deal with predators.
So you're saying that the relationship isn't that like skunks came from the other mustelids and now they're their own group, but that this was a case of convergent evolution. So when two organisms develop the same sort of adaptation independent of one another.
Yep, so it's either convergent evolution or the common ancestor had that trait and it was subsequently enhanced in skunks and enhanced in mustelids, but not enhanced in procyonids.
Interesting. Okay, so that's why raccoons don't stink.
Right. Cool. I'm sure there are people who have
many more thoughts on that.
and here's actually what's really cool too. So we know that ferrets stink. I had one as a pet. I know they stink no matter how often you clean their litter box. And anyone who's had a ferret also knows that the more you give them a bath, the more they stink. Because their stink is not associated with their scent glands, it's associated with the oil glands in their skin. So weasels and ferrets and things like that are very stinky animals, even though they're not spraying. Whereas a skunk is actually a very clean smelling animal and only stinks when it sprays, which is kind of cool.
Huh. So like when people, because like you can technically have a skunk as a pet, although I would never ever recommend that anybody get a wild animal as a pet, but like you can have a skunk as a pet and they remove the scent glands. So
Same.
like then a pet skunk without the scent glands won't smell the way a ferret does?
It might, but it just can't spray you.
Ah, okay. Huh.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. I just learned a whole bunch of things I didn't know. That's awesome. We'll switch gears a little bit because I asked you what your favorite thing about your research was. What is your least favorite thing about your current research project?
My least favorite thing about my research is that my technicians do most of the field work. And I could go out as often as I like. But when you're not forced to do it, like during my master's, I didn't have any field technicians and I had to do 100% of my data collection. But when you live an hour and 20 minutes away from your field site and you have a spouse and 2 dogs and work for a PhD, I don't get out in the field as often as I would like, even though I could technically go out every single day if I wanted to, but then I wouldn't get any of the work they're paying me to do done.
I sometimes worry about that. I just had a conversation with my advisor yesterday that like, he said more than half of your PhD is actually sitting and crunching the numbers and doing the stats rather than doing the field work, which a lot of people think the field work is the most fun part, so that does kind of stink, but the stats are the important part because that's how you figure out your results, so
yeah,
we have to sit inside.
And learning the stats and doing the stats is something that I'm currently working on, but one of the things I'm also doing is having to learn programming. And so I know programming, but I'm trying to become more efficient and better and intuitive with programming because I was just doing some number crunching and we have flipped 18,668 cover objects for salamanders and snakes in the past 8 years, and that's data I have to analyze. So unless I do that programmatically, I can't just load it up in Excel because I would go crazy and the amount of errors would be nuts. So you have to do everything programmatically when you're working with massive data scales.
I think that's something else that a lot of people don't realize, especially about like ecology field work, is that like I'm doing 2 summer seasons for my master's, and people will call that like a long-term study, which sounds ridiculous to like normal people because 2 years is not a long time, but you get such a giant volume of data that you have to deal with that any longer than that would just turn into this like massive project where you devote your whole life to it. So yeah, 8 years of data, and it's not even data that you've been sitting there taking.
Right.
That's a lot.
It's 8 years of data with 4 seasons per year. Yeah, the Access database I have has about 170,000 records in it. And that's rows, not counting columns.
Oh my gosh. Whoa.
Yeah.
That's a lot of numbers.
So I know the computer science people are probably laughing right now because that's like, oh, that's nothing.
Yeah,
But for us ecologists who do not have degrees in computer science, that is a lot of programming we have to learn just to be able to get by.
Yeah, I think that's a good point too. We have to be sort of jacks of all trades in order to do this, and you even more so. I mean, I ran 2 experiments over the summer, and then I'm learning how to do the programming for the stats, but you do modeling and stats and all of the different sorts of sampling.
Yep.
So you mentioned cover objects before. Could you share a little bit more about like how that works?
Yeah. So reptiles and amphibians are usually grouped together as herpetofauna, not because they are particularly closely related or anything like that, but it's mostly because they usually have similar life history traits. So usually reptiles and amphibians that we're studying here in the United States are small, and we live in a temperate climate where it gets hot and cold during the same year, and dry and wet. And little tiny organisms have trouble keeping their body temperature where they want it to be, and they have trouble monitoring how much water's in their body just because of physics, because of how small they are. They have a relatively small surface area to volume ratio.
And because reptiles and amphibians don't produce like their own body heat to regulate.
Right, so they're forced to rely on the environment. to get their heat, whereas we can just eat a cupcake and then get warm. A salamander can eat as much as it wants, but it won't warm up unless the air or the soil around it is warm.
Right.
So you'll often flip logs or rocks if you're out hiking and you're curious, and you'll notice that there are either little toads or little salamanders or lizards or snakes under those objects, and they're there so predators don't eat them, but also so they have better behavioral control over if they're warm or cold, hot or dry. And so what we do is we can put out artificial cover objects like pieces of metal, tin, or sheet metal, or pieces of plywood, or pieces of rubber, or pieces of carpet, or we can just look for garbage out in the woods, and you flip it over, and you hope you find something underneath it. And so we have artificial cover objects placed at 232 random permanent locations, and each of those 232 locations has 4 plywood boards, and so those get flipped fairly regularly. So we just, flip them over, and then we count and monitor what's underneath them. And so we have a lot of data over 8 years and 4 seasons from those many, many, many plywood boards that often need to be replaced because plywood gets wet and ants eat it.
Oh, yeah. Ants.
All those other things degrade them, but we have a big problem with ants, and they get under the board and then they just eat it. Or their gut bacteria eats it.
Yeah. I had a ton of problem with ants too. They got into my dung pads, and also the pitfall traps get full of ants.
Yeah.
They're just like everywhere. So you mentioned multiple different materials, but then you're only using plywood. Is there a reason or a set of conditions or like a certain species that you would need different materials?
Absolutely. So metal sheets are really nice if you're looking for reptiles or snakes, because they can get really hot and they don't hold moisture nearly as well as plywood does. The problem with metal sheets is that they are hard to carry into the field, and they look much more like garbage than very straight cut plywood boards, and so people don't like seeing them in the woods. They don't fit that natural aesthetic as much as even a very processed plywood board does. So you get more complaints when you use sheet metal. Also, sheet metal can cut technicians more easily than plywood.
Safety.
And so you also, if you put sheet metal out in the middle of the field, it's useless in the summer because it will get too hot. Whereas a plywood board is an insulator as opposed to a conductor. So it'll still get really warm under a plywood board in the middle of a field in the summer, but it'll be cooler than the surrounding area. And so plywood boards have more utility across all 4 seasons. Well, 3 seasons, we're not checking it during the winter. But sheet metal is really effective for finding snakes in the spring and fall if you put it in edge habitats where it gets warmer and cooler than the surrounding area, so it provides a lot of really nice microclimates.
What about, so you talked a lot about like how the weather can change your sampling, so what would your ideal field conditions be?
Unlike small reptiles and amphibians, I have a relatively large surface area to volume ratio as someone who is 6'3" and 250 pounds. So I get hot really quickly. So I prefer cold weather, which is not ideal for reptiles and amphibians, but it is ideal for mustelid research.
Oh, okay.
So I like upper 40s, lower 50s. For almost anything. If I'm actually like hiking up a mountain, I prefer 30s because I get hot really easily. Unfortunately, most of my field work has been in places like Florida and North Carolina, and I can deal with the heat very well, and I don't need to drink a lot of water because I'm relatively large. And so
biology has answers for everything.
Yeah, so I can handle the heat.
Okay.
But I
greatly
prefer it to be cool, and so I can wear shorts and hiking boots and a t-shirt and just go wherever I want. That's my ideal.
Yeah. I always prefer cooler weather too, because you can put on more layers if it's too cold, but you can't really take.
Yes, exactly. And there's no biting insects when it's cool.
That is super important. That is super important. All right, so you made a quick reference there to some of your prior field work. So tell us a little bit more about like how you started grad school, because you did a master's first, right? Okay. So,
sure.
Yeah.
I went to an undergrad, a specialized environmental undergrad at State University of New York College of Environmental Science in Forestry at Syracuse, which has the longest name of any university in the United States.
We like to call it SUNY.
SUNY ESF for short. And I majored in wildlife science, and our professors were very keen on telling us what we needed to do to succeed, because we were a very small program and they knew most of us, if not all of us,
so
personally. Yes. Okay. So I was told that, and everyone was told, that the days of working as a biologist with just a bachelor's were over, and you needed to go to grad school if you wanted to make more than $10 an hour, or have any semblance of a regular life. And that was fine with me, because I was a nerd, and I still am a nerd, and I like school, and I like learning, and I happen to be good at learning, so which makes school easier, which makes me like it more, because I don't have to put as much time in.
That, especially once you're in grad school, dividing your time is very important.
Yes. So I took the GREs, and I didn't study for them, and I did okay. And my advisor / mentor, she said, that's terrible. You need to do better.
Really?
Yep. And so I was like, all right, fine. And I studied it, and I took them again, and I got adequate grades that would allow me to get into basically whatever school I wanted to go to. So if GREs are not an impediment, then you have one less thing to worry about for whatever grad program you want to go to.
Although I do think that is a good note, because I didn't study for the GRE, and I think part of it depends on when you take it and how you are as a test taker, because that's a lot of what the test is testing, is how you take tests and how you think. But I don't think that it's something you have to stress out over, because it's just a number, it's just a standardized test, and I feel like grad schools mostly care a lot more about what else you're bringing to the table.
Absolutely. GREs are just, if you happen to do well, it's just one less thing you need to think about, and it can only help you.
Yeah.
But it's definitely, you'll never get into grad school based on your GREs or GPA alone for ecology. It just doesn't work that way. During my undergrad, I was doing a lot of volunteering work, just because I loved being outside and doing it, and I was at a small specialized environmental school, so I did lots of volunteering with grad students on their projects, and working with the Wildlife Society, which was our organization that represents professional wildlife biologists. And I had my first field job the summer of my junior year, and we were surveying hellbenders in southern New York, and so south central New York. And so that was really fun, and I really liked it.
Tell us what a hellbender is. I think they're awesome, but some people might not.
A hellbender is known to some people as a snot otter, or a slime weasel. And it's basically, it is the largest by mass amphibian in the United States. It's a salamander that gets about 3 feet long, and it's about 6 inches thick, and it is flat. So it's long and wide and flat, and it lives under rocks in fast-flowing cold water streams.
And they're just so adorable.
They're amazing. They eat crayfish. They have little tiny eyes. They're really, really awesome salamanders. But they're heavily imperiled due to siltation, habitat loss, possibly invasive crayfish. So we were surveying for them. That was part of my friend's graduate project. And I really enjoyed that, and I said, I don't hate this, so maybe this is the right thing, because some people go through their first field job and they say, I will never do this ever again.
It takes a special kind of person to love field work, because it's hard.
Yes. So I worked in Michigan, and we were looking at how young amphibians disperse from different vernal pools. So that was fun. And then I graduated, and then I had a couple options. and I wound up taking an internship in Florida, working at a biological station, Archbold Biological Station, and where I was again working with amphibians, but also some gopher tortoise stuff and other things. And that was pretty cool. And then I got another job / internship with the Fish and Wildlife Service in North Carolina, which involved a couple different job duties. One of the things we were doing was walking along the stretch of highway that had, it was like a 10-mile stretch of highway, and we would cover it once a week. And on either side of the guardrail, we had installed barbed wire, and we were collecting hair on the barbed wire to see what animals were crossing where, because they were proposing to expand the highway, and we wanted to know where the hot spots were for animal crossing, so we could put underpasses, potentially.
Did they actually build them, or?
I don't think they have expanded the highway yet, and this was 2011 that I was doing that. So that was cool, but then part of that was only one part of the job. The other part was roadkill surveys while we were doing that, and identifying all the reptiles and birds and animals and things that were hit, because this highway ran through a national wildlife refuge. And then we were also doing radio telemetry for black bears and red wolves. So it was a really fun job. Cool. I lived in a cabin in the middle of nowhere where you weren't supposed to drink the water. I mean, this was literally like a cabin in a swamp. Eastern North Carolina is all swamp. And it was about a half an hour to the gas station, and further if I wanted to go to the grocery store. We had this was pre-cell phone service everywhere. There was no Wi-Fi, there was nothing, we didn't have TV, and so it was really nice living in like a rustic cabin and then just doing wildlife work all day.
That's
getting done and volunteering and doing other wildlife stuff. I really liked that. What did I do after that? Then I got a job in Indiana tracking endangered timber rattlesnakes. So we'd walk around the woods all day with radio telemetry, again tracking them. And then I applied to a whole bunch of grad schools and had been during that time, and this was during the height of the financial crisis, when everyone said you'd be a good fit for my lab, but we don't have any funding right now. Try again in a couple years. And every year I wasn't going to grad school, my undergrad student loans were building up interest. And so I said, I need to get this over with. And so I wound up going to grad school for my master's, coincidentally near where I grew up, so I did not have to pay for housing.
Yay!
And so I lived with my grandfather while I was there. And it was a nice, he's like 80, he's 89. He's going to be 89 on the 4th of November.
Happy birthday, Grandpa.
But so he was in his mid-80s, and it was right at that point where he really could not live by himself, but didn't need to go somewhere else. So it was a nice beneficial thing. I lived basically in the lower apartment, and he lived upstairs, and I took him grocery shopping and stuff like that. And he didn't make me pay rent. And my dog kept him company during the day when I was at work and at school. So it was a nice little...
That's one of the dogs you still have?
Yes. Okay. So it was a nice little thing we had going there. We're both introverts, so we would just both like sit in the living room and not talk, but it was nice. So for my grad program, it was not fully funded because of this whole financial crisis thing, which is kind of making me frustrated today with student loans for my master's as well. But it was fun. I got to track eastern hognose snakes and develop my own project, and I really liked that master's program. I liked my advisor, and that makes all the difference in the world. If your advisor is your advocate and looks out for your best interest, and is someone you can just like talk to on Facebook Messenger, and you can or text them, and you don't have to worry about getting a hold of them or going through official channels. It makes grad school so much less stressful.
Yeah, I think that's something that a lot of people don't think about before they're like in this world, is that like, my advisor isn't necessarily like my peer, but we're definitely on like a first name basis, and he knows the name of my dog and my husband, and like we've done things outside of like the lab and the classroom, and I think that's important. This is forming a relationship with somebody and a trusting sort of thing to help you grow.
Ideally they should be a mentor. Unfortunately it's not often the case, but I think we have a pretty good track record in ecology and applied ecology, more so than physics, chemistry, things like that, where you're more on your own for the most part.
That would be something to put in the comments if you've had an experience in one of those other fields. But I think, at least from my in here perspective, that like ecology attracts a certain set of personalities
Yes.
and that we all sort of like do things well together.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So thinking about mentors, are there like scientists that you look up to or who really sort of inspire you to be an ecologist? Think of anybody?
Not when I was growing up and making my decision to work with wildlife and ecology and things like that. Not really.
Okay.
I was a nerd, so I read Origin of Species when I was in like 9th grade, and I had read a whole bunch of books and other things like that. So they probably all subconsciously affected me and inspired me. But there probably wasn't really one particular person. Although I did really like Steve Irwin when he was alive.
He was great.
So in hindsight, you look at your heroes and you see their flaws and stuff like that. But I really liked his message of enthusiasm and love for conservation and what you're doing and enjoying what you're doing. And he gets a bad rap a lot, I think, for being enthusiastic and silly and harassing animals. But I would argue that, and doing dangerous stuff. But I would argue that those of us who really liked watching him, we didn't see that. We saw the enthusiasm, we saw the engagement, we saw the enjoyment that he was having, and that he ultimately cared about the animals and how quickly the animals usually calmed down. And he was usually quick to say, oh, he's getting stressed, so we're going to put him down.
I think that's important. That like the whole, whether or not we agree with him catching and picking up wild animals, that he talked through his entire process every time, and he was very aware of the animal behavior, and that there was so much love, like you said, in his eyes every time he talked about an animal. I agree.
And I think if he were to just have gone out and looked at an animal and told us about it, like David Attenborough does, and which I love and now and appreciate much more as I'm older. I don't think he would have been as inspiring to as many people if he didn't have that showmanship to him. Because there are other people that catch things and talk about them while they're holding them, but they just didn't have that charisma and that spark. And then what a lot of people don't realize too is that he, all of the money he made from his show was donated to conservation, and through the proceeds from his very good zoo, which does a lot of captive breeding and things like that, and it's not just a crappy little sideshow zoo. They've bought literally hundreds of thousands of acres and have set them aside as preserves for conservation. So you can.
That's interesting. So after some technical difficulties, we've switched cameras, and what I was going to ask you, you were mentioning Steve Irwin's enthusiasm, but you also mentioned that you are an introvert.
Yes.
So how do you sort of manage those two ideas in the scientific community? Do you think that there's one strategy that's better than another, or do you think that there are like times for each of them?
I think that there are a lot of, there's definitely room for both and times for each.
Okay.
I think there are more introverts than extroverts, and more introverts than ambiverts in science. I think there are less introverts in ecology, wildlife conservation than there are in the hard sciences, or harder sciences. I think we are still a hard science.
Yeah. Do you think that's because like being outside brings it out in you, or do you think it's like the teamwork aspect of fieldwork?
I think it has to do more with there's an emotional component towards ecology and conservation and things like that, and I think it attracts more people who wouldn't usually be attracted to science than other things.
Okay.
But there's a lot of outreach and communication required in conservation work, regardless of whether you want to do it or not. And so I find it frustrating a little bit when people embrace their introvertedness
Okay.
and don't work to improve their abilities.
Awesome, which is why you're so brave as to be here doing things like this, because yeah, communicating your science should be the end goal, right? If you do the
Yes.
science and nobody knows about it or nobody understands the value of it, then what you did doesn't have a broader meaning. So
I agree. Although I think that we're a little biased in our field, but I think ecology and conservation is such a long-term thing and involves intrinsic and subtle values. So people need to be made aware of what's around them, because through no fault of their own, they might not know. What I like about what the place I work at does is they buy new properties for their preserves through referendum funding. So they'll put it up to a vote. Do you want to put a one-time 0.01 tax on your whatever, and that money will be earmarked specifically towards buying this parcel of property, and they overwhelmingly get approved in that area. But what's nice is then they put up a sign that says, "This preserve brought to you by your referendum, whatever," and then people know that they're getting what they're voting for.
Yeah, it shows that value right there. Yeah,
yes,
that's nice.
Whereas a lot of people don't, through no fault of their own, I don't think, might not notice the subtle health benefits that we get from having this little tiny forest right here, from sitting in the shade. The subtle decreases in cortisol and other stress hormones when you hear this chipmunk chirping and you don't even notice it. But there's all these little subtle benefits that build up over a long time and across hundreds of thousands and millions of people that are important, but because they're not on the forefront and they're not catastrophic, it's human evolution that we don't notice those little slide scale changes.
So talking about different ways of communicating and our interest in science communication, when you're at a conference, and you've been to several already to present research, do you prefer paper or poster, and why?
I like both if I can.
Okay. Not at the same conference, though.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh.
You can. Yeah.
I didn't know that places would let you do both.
Usually.
Okay.
Because you don't have to be in the same place at the same time.
That's true.
And usually the people who are accepting are different, so they don't even know you submitted elsewhere.
Interesting.
Some conferences have a checkbox, and they say, and some conferences will say, if you're not accepted to give this oral presentation, will you accept a poster?
Right.
But in some cases, you can submit both and have more than one.
Okay.
I like posters because I like the whole design aspect and being able to fit what you want and design pretty pictures and things like that, and you're not constrained to your time limit. Sure, yeah. But I also like giving talks because I think it's a challenge and it's adrenaline, and I like answering questions that you're not prepared for on the spot. I think can be kind of exhilarating.
Nice. I like that, even though you mentioned like adrenaline, that you say exhilarating. Did you know that only about 1% of the entire human population is not scared of public speaking? This isn't even like levels of comfort or discomfort, but like most people are like, if you look at their physiology and like their emotions, they're actually like scared of public speaking. All but 1%, which I think is crazy.
I don't think I'm afraid of it.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting. So still thinking about conferences, so what sorts of conferences have you attended / do you like to attend? Because I know they're sort of like different styles.
Most of the conferences I've attended have been regional or local, taxon specific. So I've gone to a lot of what are called the PARC conferences, which is Partners in Amphibian and Reptile Conservation. Okay. And so when I went to school in the Northeast, I went to Northeast Park most summers, which is nice because it's a small, intimate group of like 70 to 80 people.
Oh, that's,
usually in cabins at some campground somewhere, giving talks about local conservation issues that are near and dear, and everyone knows each other, and everyone knows everyone's study site for the most part. Yeah. And it's a cool way to just catch up and see what's going on, but also learn new things and upcoming trends and see who's getting funding and from where. And I've gone to the Midwest version this year. I've gone to the Long Island Natural History Conference, which is nice because it's focus on natural history, and so you can, and there are also Northeastern natural history conferences and things like that. And then the other two, the national conferences I've gone to are the Wildlife Society conferences. I've been to 3 or 4 of those, and the joint meeting of ichthyologists and herpetologists meeting, which is the big herp meeting. And I've been to 2 of those.
Thinking more about like research, because you're partway through your doctorate, so you are almost at the end of sort of what we would consider like learning to be a researcher, right? So what do you think is your biggest strength as an ecologist researcher?
I think 2 things help me out. I have a very broad knowledge base, so I think I can easily jump back and forth between different subdisciplines, and I have which I think comes from going to a really strong undergraduate program. I was exposed to a lot of stuff, a lot of which was at a high level that I feel like in some of the graduate classes I've taken have been at a lower level in some of the undergraduate classes I've taken. So all the kudos goes to my undergrad institution. And then the other thing is that I think I know a lot about the natural history of all the organisms that I am interested in, and I think that gives me a good foundation to asking good questions and coming up with good hypotheses as to how things might respond. Nice,
especially since you've got this sort of like holistic knowledge, you can think more about interactions and relationships. Nice. Flip that. What? Because you knew it was coming. What is the thing that you still need to work on the most?
I am a dabbler, and
guilty.
I like to know a little bit about. I like to know a lot about everything.
Yes.
And I like to get competent in different skills and in different knowledge bases, and then I go to something else. And you need to focus in grad school, and I've never been good at focusing and buckling down.
There are just so many interesting things.
Yes.
Yeah. That's a good point. Yeah. I don't think that you have to specialize at the exclusion of still being able to dabble.
No, I'm just very bad at prioritizing and hitting deadlines.
But that's what's nice about this project you're currently working on, is that you still get to do a lot of different things.
Yeah,
right?
That's what I really like about it.
Okay, that's good. This is more of like a personal question, because a lot of people, especially you and I, did the whole like working in the real world thing before we went to grad school. So a lot of people are curious about how you can fit grad school into like the rest of your life. So your wife is pregnant, woo! So how do you feel about the idea of trying to incorporate grad school into this like adult life where you're having a family and all of that sort of stuff?
Yeah, I think if you're in a good program with a supportive set of advisors, I think there's never a better time to have a kid, because I will never have more flexibility. So Claire's going to go back to work, and I'm going to be watching the kid for the first year or so. But when you work in a university, you make your own hours for the most part. I don't share an office with anyone because my other 2 lab mates are commuters, and so they're only here on Mondays and Wednesdays. And because a lot of what the work I do is on the computer with my technicians collecting data, I'll go into the field even less, but I can do most of my work from home.
Nice.
And once the kid can hold its neck up, it can come with me into the field.
Backpack?
Yes, we already got one.
Yeah, awesome.
Front pack.
Ooh, okay. Yeah, very nice. Yeah, I think that will be an amazing sort of situation and an amazing way to grow up too. Getting to spend so much time outside and learning, and
I think so.
that's exciting. Okay, well I'm glad that it's something that you're finding a way to make work.
The caveat to that is that my wife has a real job and makes real money.
That's
which makes things much easier than living on 2 graduate stipends.
That'll be a different story with one of our future guests who's in a similar situation. But yeah, I think that's a good insight, that a lot of people are afraid of the idea of starting a family while you're doing stuff like this because there's so much pressure. But yeah, like we do get to make our own time for the most part. So
Yep.
yeah.
Yes.
And the wrap-up question, even though it's super trite, is what's next for you?
I'm going to try not to do a postdoc because I feel like that sounds like the worst.
Okay.
I'm going to try to get a job teaching at a smaller university in the Northeast.
Yeah.
I like teaching. But that is relatively unrealistic. There are more PhDs than there are positions available. And limiting yourself to a geographic area is often very limiting.
Yeah.
But we're going to try, and if that doesn't work, I would be just as happy getting a job as a biologist with a state or federal agency or nonprofit.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to be flexible, and so I'm not set on any particular career choice, but I have my preferences.
That's fair. But you do want to like stay in research.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Nice. Well, I'd like to thank John ever so much for being patient with all of the technical difficulties today and for being brave enough to go second on the Explain Yourself series. Thank you, and we of course wish you luck with all of your research and data crunching and things. If you liked this video, don't forget to like it. If you didn't like this video, please share it with someone who would. And if you'd like to support the Roving Naturalist, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.